Great. Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Becker, editor of Words Without Borders. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event, World in Verse, a celebration of the 2020 Poems in Translation contest winners. We'll get started in just a few minutes, but before we do, I wanted to walk you through what you can expect this evening and draw your attention to the various Zoom features that you can avail yourself of throughout the event. We will be recording this event and posting it to our YouTube channel and elsewhere shortly. First, a note that we'll be muting everyone except for our participants to ensure we can hear our readers tonight. We ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the event. The evening will look something like this. After I've introduced our host for the evening, David Tomas Martinez, we'll proceed to hear from him and from several of our contest winners who will be sharing their work with you tonight. I'll also mention that this evening is a multilingual affair. We'll have readings of each poem in both the original language and in English translation. And for the English language portions of the event, we will have closed captioning available. To turn that on, just click the arrow next to CC on your bottom toolbar and select Show Subtitles. In the chat window at your right, I direct your attention to an accessibility packet, which my excellent colleague Nina is sharing right now. You'll notice on the top right of the Zoom application window that you have the option to toggle between a gallery view, which will show everyone including all the other attendees, and a speaker view. We suggest speaker view so that you can see our readers as they perform tonight. I'll note that WWB is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, and our readers provide a crucial source of support for our mission of expanding cultural understanding through the translation, publication, and promotion of the finest international literature. We've been doing this work for 17 years now, publishing more than 2,500 works of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry by writers from more than 130 countries, whose work has been translated from more than 120 languages. And while our monthly magazine and rich archive at wordswithoutborders.org are free and available to all, we'd like to ask that if you like what you hear tonight, you consider giving what you can at wordswithoutborders.org/donate. No amount is too large or too small. You can follow the link in the chat window to do that. Also, just because you're all on mute doesn't mean you can't offer your reactions to the readings you'll hear tonight. I think some of you, I see some of you have already started to share your location, but please use the chat window at right throughout the event to offer your remarks, your reactions, and to ask any questions you'd like to have answered during our Q&A, which will immediately follow the performances here tonight. Finally, I'd also like to mention that if you like to keep up with what we do, you can sign up for our free newsletter, and the link for that can also be found in the chat window at right. I think we will get started now. So I'll thank those of you who have come in during my remarks here for joining us for a special evening to celebrate the winners of the 2020 Poems in Translation contest. We have people joining us from many different cities, as we could see from the registration. So if you feel so moved, let us know in the chat window at right where you're tuning in from tonight. This is the second year we've partnered with the Academy of American Poets to spotlight the work of 4 poet-translator duos from around the world through the Poems in Translation contest. We've been publishing the 4 winning poems selected by contest judge and this evening's host, David Tomas Martinez, in the Academy's Poem a Day newsletter and on wordswithoutborders.org. To give you an idea of the competition, we began with 935 poems from 448 poets from 87 countries, translated from 58 languages. And from 25 finalists, David selected 4 winning poems, which you'll hear tonight. For those of you who want to learn more about the contest, I direct you to the link in the chat window where you can find all of the winning poems presented in both English translation and in the original language, accompanied by audio recordings made by the poets and translators themselves. These poems, as I mentioned earlier, have appeared over the last 4 Saturdays in the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day newsletter, which reaches 500,000 subscribers worldwide, and which you can sign up for at poets.org/poemaday. We are grateful and thrilled to have partnered with the Academy again this year, and for the Academy's commitment to poetry in translation. That's enough for me, I think. I'd like to start by introducing David Tomas Martinez, who served as judge for this year's contest. I'll direct you to the link to his full bio in the chat window, but we'll share the highlights here. David is a Pushcart Prize-winning poet and recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. He's published widely, including in Poetry Magazine, Tin House, and the Academy's very own Poem a Day. He's also been featured on NPR's All Things Considered, and he lives in Brooklyn. David has been exceedingly generous and passionate in his role as judge for his contest. And as you'll likely glimpse from his remarks, he's a true champion of our winners and their work. So David, I just want to start by saying thanks, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Eric. So I guess before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about translation. And when I was asked to judge this, I was really excited because one, for me, the poems that have been brought into the English language from other languages, specifically languages I don't speak, they're super important. They've been really important to my aesthetic, but there's not just one translation that's needed. I always like to have like 5 different translations, and like I'm like, oh, it's this line, and then this stanza, oh, and how it all, and it is an art form all in itself. And I completely have admiration for the skill that it takes to translate work. You know, I translated, doing doctoral work at Houston, I translated some Rubén Darío, and you know, like, yeah, who hasn't, right? You know what I mean? And but you know, in one of the parts, I had mistaken brazier, I think that's how you say it, where like the fireplace, the little metal receptacle part, you know, that goes in there, with brazier. And so in my poem, it said brazier, and it was like a brazier. And so like everyone got a big laugh out of it. And I was like, what are you guys laughing about? And then they pointed out, and I was like, oh, oops. I was like, you know, so like these sort of things, these little mistakes, it really started bringing me to like a little more intimate knowledge of like how difficult this is and the intricacies of the language that I know as a poet, but you know, working in the translation really highlighted that. So, you know, that being said, I was super excited to do that because of this. So our first reader will be Nguyễn-Hoàng Quyên, reading Learning Late Letters, which he not only wrote, but also translated into English from Vietnamese. Born in 1993, Quyên is a translator, writer, and curator based in Vietnam. You'll find a link to her poems in the chat. And here's a little bit of a snippet of what I had to say about this poem. What is literature but us writing with our ancestors? And is not history but an adoption of ancestral perceptions? This epistolary poem eruditely juggles historical and literary complexities while also maintaining an exquisitely bedecked language. And like culture, it cyclically tumbles ideas from the frequency of the number 36, about death, about speaking, over and over, changing them as we experience each line. It truly is a wonderful poem.
Thank you, David, for sharing your thoughts on translation, for such kind words on my work. So I'll be reading my poem in Vietnamese and in English. I'm my own duo, so I'll be reading both. And I'll read them sort of side by side. So hopefully you can get a sense of the parallel rhythms between the Vietnamese and the English, or the lack thereof. Jan chữ chết. Người chết không buông tha chúng ta. Tôi vừa nói với anh bạn Sirius, vừa xếp những lá thư của cha tôi vào ngăn kéo. Đó là nhục hình Mendoza mà tôi phải chịu, tức là bị buộc vào một người chết. Tay áp tay, miệng kề miệng trong một nụ hôn buồn. Những lá thư đã ngừng đến từ đất nước của tuổi thơ tôi. Người viết thư đã chết, một cái chết cô đơn và được chôn bên bờ nước. Nhưng người vẫn đây, da người chạm da tôi. Hơi thở tôi thổi sống làn môi ấy. Tôi bảo Sirius, người ở đây này, khi tôi đang nói chuyện với anh, khi tôi ăn, khi tôi ngủ, khi tôi dạo chơi. Dường như tôi mới chính là người chết. Còn cha tôi, người chết không để tôi yên ấy, lại đang ngập tràn sự sống. Người ám tôi, hút máu tôi, cặm xương tôi, muốn suy nghĩ tôi. Learning late letters. The dead don't let us go, I say to my friend Sirius, putting my father's letters in a drawer. It is the plight of mesenterics that I endure, attached to a dead man, hand in hand, mouth in mouth, in a sad embrace. The letters stopped arriving from the country of my childhood. The man who wrote them died a solitary death and was buried at the edge of a stream. But he is there, his skin touches my skin, my breath gives life to his lips. He is there, I say to Sirius, when I speak to you, when I eat, when I sleep, when I take a walk. It seems to me that I am dead, whereas my father, the dead man who refuses to leave me in peace, overflows with life. He possesses me, sucks my blood, gnaws my bones, feeds on my thoughts. Chết tươi, chết héo, chết đau, chết biếng, chết cứng, chết đứng, chết nằm, chết đêm, chết thêm, chết khiếp, chết dần, chết mòn, chết tòi, chết ngóp, chết ngất, chết tất, chết cả, chết lử, chết lả, chết đứ, chết đừ, chết ngay, chết quay, chết ngỏm, chết ngoẻo, chết thối, chết nát, chết hết, chết sạch, chết tái, chết tím, chết ngồi, chết sáng, chết chiều, chết bỏ, chết dở. Die fresh, die withered, die sore, die throbbing, die hard, die standing up, die lying down, die nightwise, die more, die horrified, die gradual, die corroding, die squashed, die choking, die fainting, die everything, die all, die falling, die swooning, die tense, die loose, die now, die spinning, die quashed, die quelled, die rotting, die crushed, die everyone, die clean, die raw, die bruised, die sitting, die morning-wise, die afternoon-wise, die departing, die undoing. Trong thư cuối, người dạy tôi tổng cộng 36 kế chết người. Người dặn đây là 36 tài liệu công tác ngụy quân ngụy quyền, 36 phép rùng rợn, 36 vẻ phù hoa, 36 món chết người, 36 món chết. Suốt đêm tôi niệm bài ca quỷ ám của người, tụng đi tụng lại như một trái tim điên. Chảy dòng những giọt đồng hồ, giai điệu người bay xa kiếp giáo lý. Khi Sirius hỏi sao tôi cứ lẩm nhẩm lời người, tôi đáp: để tôi học tiếng cha tôi, dạt vào giấc trưa tuổi thơ tôi, tan vào đất đỏ, nhiệt đới tôi. Chữ người chết nung tôi, thúc tôi nói với họ, nói họ, rồi họ nói tôi, cả khi tôi ngủ. Mỗi giấc mơ là một căn phòng, nơi những bài luyện chữ, như gió thổi, ngân tôi, tái thiết tôi, mang tôi cận kề con nước, nơi cha tôi nằm. Hằng đêm người vẫn nói mớ một thứ phách nhịp chết người thấm xuyên lưỡi vợ tôi. In the last letter, the dying man taught me a lesson of 36 deadly tricks. He called them the 36 documentations of secret agencies, 36 spells of horror, 36 faces of vanity, 36 tactics of being deadly, 36 stratagems of dying. All night long, I chant his weird song over and over like a crazy heart. Dripping drops of time, the tune flies far from the propaganda of a human life. When Sirius asks why I keep murmuring the lines, I say it helps me learn my father tongue, glide into my childhood siesta, melt into my red, hot girdle of earth. The letters of the dead burn me, urge me to speak to them, speak them, have them speak me, even in my sleep. Every dream is a chamber where the language drills, like vital winds hum me anew, blowing me closer to the waters where my father lies. Every night he still sleep talks his fatal rhythm through my broken tongue. Bài thơ gom chữ từ hai tác phẩm. Một là tiểu thuyết Thư Chết của Linda Lê, được dịch ra tiếng Việt bởi Bùi Thu Thủy, xuất bản do Nhã Nam và Nhà xuất bản Văn học ở Hà Nội năm 2013, trang số 7. Và thứ hai là tiểu thuyết Những ngã tư và những cột đèn của Trần Dần, do Nhã Nam và Hội Nhà văn xuất bản năm 2017, trang 259. The poem assembles texts from two novels. The first is Thư Chết, or Dead Letters, by Linda Lê, translated into Vietnamese by Bùi Thu Thủy, published in Hanoi in 2013, page 7. And the second is Những ngã tư và những cột đèn, or Crossroads and Lampposts, by Trần Dần, published in 2017 by Nhã Nam and Nhà xuất bản Hội Nhà văn, page 259. Thank you.
Next up, am I supposed to be? Okay. Next up, we have Julio Pazos Barrera reading the Spanish original of his poem Pegasus' Autopsy, or Disección del Caballero de Pegaso, translated into English by Bryan Mendoza. Born in Baños, Ecuador in 1944, Julio Pazos Barrera has made a name for himself by becoming a poet, literary critic, and connoisseur of traditional Ecuadorian cuisine. In 2010, he received the National Ecuadorian Prize in Literature. Julio is joining us via audio recording. A link to this poem can be found in the chat. And here is a little bit of a snippet that I had to say about this poem. Pegasus' Autopsy is a clinical precision of a poem. The wonder hum of fluorescent light fixtures can be felt in each sparse line. In this wholly modern poem, myth perishes in the cathedral of modern science, the hospital. The only simile is an anachronistic mode of travel, sailing, where it too perishes after having suffered a shipwreck. Everywhere here, the old falls to the new. This poem is as tragic as it is beautiful, and every word feels purposeful.
Disección del cadáver de Pegaso. Es una sala espaciosa, muy clara, es luz que refracta el bosque lejano. Sobre la mesa yacen el cuerpo y las alas extendidas como velas de bajeles deshechos. Han hilvanado el despojo sin otro motivo que algo semejante a la caridad. Pronto llegarán los voluntarios y se llevarán el cuerpo, incluidas las alas, al basural.
I present Bryan Mendoza. Bryan, who translated this poem, is currently a senior at Yale University studying literature and comparative cultures and evidently crushing it.
Pegasus Autopsy. It's a spacious chamber, well lit, a light that refracts the distant woodland. Over the table lies the body and the wings outspread, like sails of a shipwreck. They've stitched together the carnage with no other motive than something comparable to mercy. Soon, the volunteers will arrive, and they'll take the body, including the wings, to the landfill. Thank you.
Great. I'll jump in just a second. Great to hear from you, Bryan. Thank you for that reading. I'll remind people who may have just been joining since we got started. At right in the chat window, you can find an accessibility packet if you'd like to follow along. And also just a reminder that if you like what you're hearing tonight, please consider supporting our work at wordswithoutborders.org. And now I'll hand it back to David.
Now we'll hear from Ching, who is joining us from Hong Kong this evening. Yao will be reading her winning poem, Trial Run, via video recording, but will be around for your questions later. So don't forget to post those in the chat window at right. You can also say hello to me, say what's up, throw up the dub. Born in Hong Kong, Yao has authored more than 10 books, including award-winning poetry collections, and recently a series of collections of writing on film, art, and politics. This is a stunning poem. Trial Run, this is from my citation. Trial Run is a brilliant poem. Despite the puzzle of the poem, it can be returned to again and again. In the white space of the poem resides our fears about mortality, playing out the mind's tireless effort to occlude temporality. This poem slightly adjusts and comments, culminating with a playfulness that calls back the title, Trial Run, which in itself comments on life. If sleeping really is the practice for eternity, maybe death is the sad championship of the living. You can find a link to the poem in the chat, and here's Yao.
預習猶靜，未知生焉知，不能復生是如歸而無憾。出生入一線間，生契闊，輕於鴻毛，而後已而復生。不冥目，不足惜，令不屈。名不默，一雞一鳴撐飯蓋鴨升天，憂患不終無安樂，嗱嗱嗱，未得咧你就想。
And now, reading her English translation of Trial Run is translator Chenxin Jiang. Chenxin translates from Italian, German, and Chinese. Her translations of Tears of Salt, a Doctor Story by Pietro Bartolo and Lydia Tilotta, I guess that's from Norton, was shortlisted for the 2019 Italian Prose in Translation Award.
Thanks, David. And thanks also to the Words of That Buddhist team for all the thought you put into so many details for this event. It's really nice to hear everyone read. Okay, this is Trial Run by Yao Ching. As a doornail and gone to the world, air, broke, drop. Nothing is certain but and taxes. Mask, knell, grip, blow, metal, rattle. Food for worms, sticky end, brown bread. Or alive, valiant to the la, la, la. Wish I were, yeah, right, you wish.
Evening. We are joined by Enrique Villasis and his translator Bernard Capinpin. Who will be reading from their winning poem Birds in Flight 1965. Enrique is a poet and a scriptwriter born in Villasis, Masbate, Philippines, who has received numerous national literary awards for his poems. Bernard is a poet and translator who resides in Quezon City, Philippines. You can find a link to the poem in the chat window. And here's what I had to say about the poem. I mean, all of these were so striking. It was super easy to say something about, so hope you like these. Birds in Flight 1965 enters readers in a moment of time that emblemizes a natural phenomenon. That of birds flying together as metaphor for not exactly transcendence, but as the postmodern expression of cohesive simultaneity. The speaker experiences via the birds flying separately, yet concordantly, an immanence and a transcendence, a growth and a regression, a lightness and a density, an innocence and a wisdom.
Maraming salamat, David, for that awesome citation to my poem, Birds in Flight, 1965. Hindi marami, kundi iisa, dinakip sa bilis ng mga iglap upang mapiit sa ilusyon ng liwanag ng maitanghal sa holograpikong pag-iral at makapagbigay bigat sa kahulugan ng gaan. Dito, ganap niyang naituturo ang mga direksyon ng kanyang pagkakakulong. Lubos ang pagkakapurol ng mga pakpak at ang pagaspas ay orkestradong pagkabasag ng mga salamin. Manipis, pino, linyado. Nasa lapit ng ilaw ang tingkad ng paninilaw, katulad kung papaano kinikilala sa ilalim ng bumbilya ang nanahang sisiw sa itlog upang mabakas ang kapal ng pamamalikmata sa labirinto ng pluralidad. Ngayon, kahit papaano, tila pumpon ito ng mga bonggambilya sa palad nangangarap makaalpas. Na maaaring totoo ito ukol sa pagnanasa. Unang isinilid sa dibdib ang mga simpleng bagay na minahal noong kabataan. Ang paghabol sa napatid na guryon, ang hindi pag-alintana sa kalabit ng mga tinik, ang pagyukod ng makahiya sa talampakan. Ganoon lamang ang kalayaan. Hindi nakikipagpatintero sa mga anino, hindi nakapiit sa multiplisidad ng mga huwad na hubog. Halos babasagin, ngunit orihinal. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, David. Here is Enrique Villasis, Birds in Flight, 1965. Not as a multitude, but as one, caught in the rush of an instant, only to be contained in an illusion of light, once depicted in a holographic existence, and to give weight to the meaning of lightness. Here, he pointed to the directions of his imprisonment, how the wings have too much dulled, and to take wing must orchestrate the shattering of mirrors, fragile, fine, acicular. The yellowing brightness is in the proximity to the light, like how one recognizes beneath the light bulb the chick nestling within an egg, as to trace how thick illusions go in the labyrinth of plurality. Now, no matter what, they seem a bouquet of bougainvillea on the palms, dreaming to be set free. This may be true of desire. One first keeps to heart the simplest things one loved in childhood, the chase after a kite broken loose, not minding the prickling thorns, the mimosa's curtsy to the soul. That is what freedom simply is, not playing patintero with shadows, not captive to the multiplicity of false geometry, almost brittle, but original. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique Bernard. And thank you to everyone for joining us. You can find all the poems you heard here tonight over at wordswithoutborders.org and at poets.org. Links, once again, are in the chat window. And also, I'd also like to say one last thing about, it's events like this where we have poets that are coming from different parts of the world, speaking in different languages and different topics, but there's something that's really underneath it that's connecting all of us. And I mean, that's the power of poetry, right? It's not poetry in itself, but it's something inside of it that isn't really encapsulated by language, by a particular emotion. There's just something inside it. And it's really beautiful that everyone would join us tonight. So with that, back to Eric.
Great, thanks, David. Really well put. And thanks to all our readers and David for their performances tonight. We really appreciate it, and we're glad that all of you have joined us. A reminder that you can post your questions in the chat window at right if you haven't already, and we'll get to as many of these as we have time for. Before we jump in, I just wanted to note that if you enjoyed tonight's event, in a few short weeks on October 27th, Words Without Borders will be hosting its first ever virtual gala with a truly global cast of writers and translators, including National Book Award nominee Megha Majumdar and Booker Prize finalist Maza Mangiste. That is a ticketed event with proceeds going to support WWB's work in the upcoming year. You can follow the link in the same place as always, chat window at right, to reserve your spot. And let's see, let's get to your questions here, and I'll see whether we have some. Otherwise, I will get us started as well. All right, so all right. As we wait for those to come in, I'll get one started myself. And Bryan, I've got a question for you. I thought I'm going to make an assumption based on your youth that this is one of your first forays into literary translation, and quite a strong one. Obviously, it was great to have you with us tonight and to have your work. We're really grateful to have been able to publish it. I'd be curious to know what prompted your interest in literary translation and translating poetry in particular, and how you found your way to Julio's work.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity. And yeah, I'd love to answer your questions. So I did recently fall into literary translation after taking a course last semester, all about literary translation. And I had thought about working on translation studies after studying abroad in Ecuador, where I actually met the poet Julio Pazos Barrera. And he actually read his poetry to the group I was with. And he gave me some of his poems, and they've always been special to me. And once I joined that literary translation course, I thought it was an opportunity to express my love for the poems by bringing them into English and sharing them with the people I love.
I think that's the way, you know, if a lot of people end up finding their way to translation sort of through passion, really. And thank you for sharing your story with us. Looks like a few more have come through. Let's see. For Quyên, or actually, you know what? Let's go through first to all the translators, and maybe I'll call on you one by one, so to give some order to this. But the question that someone's posed to all of you is why you chose to translate these particular poems. So why don't we start with Bernard?
Hello. Well, I chose to translate Birds in Flight because of the ambition that you can see with the writer. There is a certain loftiness to his project, according to Enrique in his poetics regarding the collection of his poems, which this poem is taken from. He writes that he aspires to become, to don the mask of a curator and historian for the paintings of Vicente Manansala. So I guess that's my reason for translating this work.
That's great. And how about you, Chengxin? How did you find your way to Yao Ching's work?
Yeah, so just a minute. I think I've managed to unmute myself. Okay, yeah, so Yao Ching's work in general, we actually found each other through Asymptote, the journal, and also through Steve Bradbury, a great translator friend who had started working on some of Yao Ching's poems. And then why this poem in particular, I've actually translated sort of a number of Yao Ching's poems, and this one in particular, Trial Run, number one is, or was, I think at the time, difficult. Like, I think at first I just had no idea how I was going to translate it, and it was sort of a fun thing to think through and sit with. And then two, also, is very compelling for many of the reasons that I think David put better than I possibly could have, because there's just so much in, yeah, I think it's, yeah, but just because there's so much in what's said and what's left out. And again, David says it better.
Great. And Bryan, I think you sort of, you may have felt like you answered this one, but I wonder if you want to add anything about why this poem from Julio.
Of course. David actually hit it on the head when he said that this poem, every word matters. And when I read the original, I felt the same way. And I find it in translation, it's difficult to make that happen, to not have filler words or words to kind of coax the meaning back out of it, so to speak. But it was a challenge I was willing to take up, and I think I did successfully, and I was very happy with it.
That's great. I would definitely say there's no reason to be shy about the fact that you did it successfully, for sure, and I think we'd all agree with that. So thanks for sharing it with us. And Quyên, of course, how did you find your way? How did you find your way to this poem of yours? And why did you decide? I mean, maybe a pertinent question is why did you decide to translate this poem?
That's an existential question. How did you find yourself?
Oh, okay. Yeah, this turns quickly into kind of a philosophical inquiry. I mean, this particular poem, I think I approached it the same way as I do with any of my other writings, which is I come to create the text sort of bilingually in the process of creating the poem, the text, or the essay. So translation was already kind of embedded in anything that I write. With this particular poem, I think it's a poem about reading. And with these two texts that I quoted, there were particular passages I really, really loved and just wanted to turn it into another language. So the poem was really just kind of a formal occasion to translate writers that I really, really admire.
Eric, I think you're muted.
There's a mute unmute thing here. All right, let me try that again. Quyên, I was going to say in your particular case, you know, we're familiar at WWB with your work before. You've translated other work from for us in the past, and I wonder if you wanted to comment at all, sort of about this difference in the process between you know, translating your own work and translating the work of another poet or another writer. Just a moment. Can we unmute? There we go.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm still thinking about. And it's also, I guess, a distinction between like yourself and like another, like what is the difference between a language that comes from inside of you and a language or a text that comes from someone else, someone dead even. And for me, sometimes the border kind of gets blurred because when I translate someone else, I often spend a lot of time with the text, and so after like a few months, it seems like it's something that you're so close with textually, but also kind of physically. You're just kind of with that book for such a long time that it seems like you're translating something very close. And then when I translate myself, I think you, I don't know if there are like self-translators in this group, but I think you sort of have to get some distance from the original text as well. And so at some point you also become kind of strange to yourself by the process of crossing into a different language. And so I'm sure there are technical differences, but for me, it seems sort of fluid. Yeah, I just approach a text as a text and not think so much about the authorship as something that creates like a kind of a decisive difference, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. I think we have time for a few more questions. The next one, it looks like, is for Enrique. The question is, when you wrote Birds in Flight, did you feel yourself channeling more the spirit of the place of your birth in Masbate or of your current home in Quezon City, which you share with Bernard, a place of residence you share with Bernard? So.
That's a good question. I was wondering, I've also I've been writing about an essay about my hometown, Milagros, Masbate, and then I realized that most of my poems really are situated in my province. My first book is about the bestiaries or animalia of creatures that I find in my hometown, and then I just transpose it in the same way I look at it in the Birds in Flight. I think of it as a a pastoral poem, which is a pastoral poem and an ode to my childhood, where I just feel free and innocent about everything, and then then use it to what I see in Birds in Flight 1965, to the painting of Manansala.
Yeah, so that for those of you, Enrique also is a contributor who's to WWB before this, and you have, correct me if I'm wrong, Enrique, a series of poems about this painting. Is correct, right?
Yes, Manansala is a national artist for visual arts here in the Philippines. So he has a lot of paintings. Most of it are painted in his art style known as transparent cubism. And I choose his bird series, or what they call as his weir series. So most of it are transposition of his cubism style to my own lyricism. So I just try to marry those two elements.
That's great. And so I think our next question is for Chengxin. Yes, it's for Chengxin. And that is, along with death, this is in trial run, of course. Along with death, there is humor that lives in those white spaces, the white spaces of the poems. I wonder if how did you approach the wordplay and turns of phrase in the translation? So if there's anything in particular you want to say about, about how you approached this translation.
Yeah, I guess I could say a little bit about that. So maybe just a couple of things. First of all, I think there's just such richness in the different kinds of vocabulary that Yao Qing's drawing from in Chinese, and the sort of vast range of registers. And I think that's part of what makes the poem funny, so I try to capture a little bit of that. And then I think there's also sort of difference in, let me rephrase, I think that there's also sort of a range in terms of, an almost free association-ish aspect of the poem versus a very imagistically strong aspect. And I think I tried to capture a little bit of that too. But yeah, it's a really great poem.
Great. And so I think we have probably time for one more, or actually two questions here that I think we can probably sort of combine, because I think they sort of dialogue with each other. And that the first part of that question, I guess, would be, and this is an open question to all of the writers and translators, which is, would you consider, or how would you consider, in what ways would you consider translation a form of art and expression in itself? And closely related to that, perhaps you wish to comment on some aspect about, we've talked, Chengxin, you just finished talking about sort of certain aspects of Yao Qing's poetry that you tried to sort of emphasize in your translation. But if everyone wants to say a word or about sort of what they felt was most important to capture in their translation as well, that's perhaps a second part of the question, if anyone cares to answer. So let's start with maybe with Bernard. Just sorry to put you on the spot there. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yes, I'm sorry. What was the first part of the question again?
I guess there's two questions, and of course the writers can jump in here too, which is a question about do you consider or in what ways in what ways is literary translation sort of an art in form of expression itself, as opposed to maybe a derivative one.
Okay, so well, I think that translation as a form of art um, necessarily comes from or it's hinged with a certain art of reading. So reading a work in one language and translating it to another um, are indeed connected. So well, for me, translation is like also an art of interpretation based on the reading of a work. It's much like, let's say, an actor or interpreting the lines of a play, or um, a musician performing another's composition. It's something like that for me.
Unmute myself here. Does Quyên, do you maybe want to go take this next? I think also is sort of having a unique view on this, being both writer and translator.
For me, if I get the question right, like just what priority aesthetically or formally do I have?
Or with whether generally or with this poem, or if you care to comment on sort of this idea of literary translation as an art in and of itself, as opposed to something merely in service of another writer's work.
Yeah, I totally think of translation as a legitimate and beautiful art form of its own. Yeah, I mean, I think by now, I don't think it's seen as just a sort of derivative or second-rate version of the original anymore. Maybe that's just me. I think translators are incredibly important to my education, because I love world literature, and without translators, there's no way that I would get so much access to just like so much beauty that's not in either Vietnamese or English, which is the languages that I speak. And for me, in terms of the art form, I think what's hardest or most difficult for me when I translate, and I noticed that someone posed a question, I think it was Suzanne, who asked what gave me disappointments as I translated the poem. And I think the thing that kind of gives me the most difficulty is translating the music or the rhythm of the original. Of course, the meaning and the diction and the politics and the history of a work is really important. And there's a sort of kind of inarticulatable music or rhythm or spaces or emptiness in the original. It's really hard to capture once you sort of transfer it into another language. And so there, in this poem of mine, for example, the section that I quoted, Chenxin, who's generally known as a really avant-garde figure in Vietnamese post-war literature. I mean, his rhythm is very much, for me, untranslatable, and yet I think it's nice that I found a way to sort of insert my own music, and at the same time sort of failing to replicate his very incredible rhythm of talking about death.
Bryan, do you care to say anything?
Of course. Yeah, when I first started studying literary translation, which was fairly recently, I didn't think of it as a way to express myself, but as I've been doing it and practicing, it's come to become one of my favorite ways to express myself, because just being able to be the bridge between languages at some points really helps you clarify your own thoughts and emotions when it comes to poetry. And you learn a lot about both languages and yourself in the process. And I think that's really special.
Great. Let's see. I think do any does Enrique care to say anything about that? Otherwise, I think we can
Sure.
propagate that. But go for it. Great.
Sure, Eric. Here in the Philippines, in Tagalog, we call translation as pagsasalin. Salin is an act of transferring a liquid or water to one container to another container. So whatever the container is, whatever its shape may be it, once there is an act of pagsasalin or translation, the water is still water.
Great.
And I think that's what's beautiful about translation.
Right. Still water, and yet having been transferred to a different vessel, has taken on its own form, I guess, in the particularities of that vessel. Right. Well, great. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I think that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Want to thank particularly our winners and our contest judge for taking us through this evening. We've been fortunate to be treated to 4 examples of some of the great poetry being written today across languages, countries, cultures. And speaking for myself and my colleagues, we're only too pleased to share it with you here this evening. A quick reminder, you can read the poems at wordswithoutborders.org and at poets.org. You can also sign up at wordswithoutborders.org to receive our newsletter for next year's contest as well. So long, everybody. Thanks again.